Welcome to Careers in Discovery, your window into the world of leaders in pharma and biotech. Brought to you by Singular Talent, making hiring better for organizations involved in drug discovery and R&D. Farid Khan is the CEO and founder of PharmaKure, a biotech company taking a novel approach to treating complex neurological diseases. Farid talks us through his fascinating entrepreneurial career, along with the opportunity presented by repurposing drugs and the learning curve involved in starting and building a biotech business. This week, I am delighted to be joined by Farid Khan of PharmaKure. Farid, welcome to Careers in Discovery.
Oh, happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Of course, really good to see you. And I'm really excited to dive into your career, Farid, and learn a bit about your journey, because I know it's been a fascinating one. We always start by talking about what you're up to now. And so I'm really interested to learn more about PharmaKure to start with, and particularly, your approach to the problem of neurodegeneration.
Thank you. So I'm the CEO of PharmaKure. PharmaKure is a spin-out from the University of Manchester. It's dedicated to finding treatments for brain diseases, in particular Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Mm-hmm. Because right now we don't have anything. We don't have no arsenal drugs.
Yes.
Let alone even a very good diagnostic for these diseases as well. So I lead the scientific team in research and development. So what does that mean? I develop assays and we're looking into making what we call biomarkers. Biomarkers are those sort of proteins, if you like, in blood or other organs to find whether the severity of the disease and whether we can add drugs to those or indeed have drug treatments so that we can see the effects, the biochemical effects, whether a drug works or not. So that's something that I'm involved with. So I work with clinicians in that regard as well, and in particular clinical trials. So we are a clinical trials company. In other words, we've started human trials, which I'll talk to you about.
Yeah.
In particular, the company's uniqueness is that we're using drug repurposing.
I see.
And this is quite interesting because, the drug development pipeline for a drug can be up to 15, 20 years. And if we find other drugs that already work in other indications, so we know the safety of these drugs, and we don't need to have a lot of preclinical work, then why wouldn't we use these drugs in other diseases? So, it fast tracks drug development, and this is something that I'm really, really quite excited about and will share with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we saw a bit of a trend around repurposing a few years back, and it seems to have quietened down a little bit, but there's clearly lots of ground to cover there, and there's all these drugs out there that have been approved for one thing, and then it's not worth the time for the company or the resource for the company to approve it for something else, but for another group and for another set of circumstances there can be real therapeutic value there, right? So there's a huge amount of potential waste sat on the shelf in pharmacies in hospitals around the world.
Absolutely. There is a problem here. Pharmaceutical companies don't like old drugs because they're off patents, and they like new drugs because they can have new patents and have a runway of 15, 20 years on the patents. And so are they risk averse? Well, as a human being, what you want is a treatment. So
right, it
may cost less and fast track us, but there may be not huge excitement from the pharmaceutical industry. But if we talk about Alzheimer's, it's a complete desert out there.
Yes.
There is no treatment. Cancers, you'll have 2 or 3 treatments for different cancers. And Alzheimer's, we're talking if you reach the age of 65, 1 in 10 people can have Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. And if you look at the cost of dementia and Alzheimer's, and you total up all the cancers in the world and heart disease, it's still a higher cost than all of those diseases put together.
Is that right?
Yeah, because it's not just the individual who's deteriorating, losing cognition, but you've got the societal impact of that. Someone is going to look after them, you have a home, and etc. That impact is huge. So there's a desperate need, really, not only for treatments, but early diagnosis. And if there's something that we can do to kind of, even if we stave off the effects of these devastating diseases by slowing them down by 5 years, will make a huge economic impact.
Yes, yeah, and I think you touched on it in your when you were talking about the company at the beginning. One of the reasons that there's this lack of treatment is that it's so complex, right? Anything to do with the brain, and particularly neurodegeneration, is so complex to not just treat, sorry, but diagnose. So tell us a bit more about your approach and about the biomarkers and the way you're tackling this problem.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The problem we have is complexity, and so Alzheimer's starts kicking in after later years, but there are genetic forms of Alzheimer's disease where it accelerates. You have a very quick mode of action. Within years, you can see neurodegeneration, memory loss, all of these kind of. And so you can see the culprits, and a lot of these culprits, and there's some controversial theories here. There's these proteins which misfold and aggregate. So if you chop open an Alzheimer's brain, you see all these tangled and plaques in there, and these consist of various proteins. One's called beta amyloid, another is tau, etc. All of these proteins, but essentially these are we believe that these proteins do cause this neurotoxicity. But the problem is, a protein, you can have one monomer and you can have a dimer because they come together,
right,
etc. So the complexity increases, and the who did it is also important, because it's the medium size of these proteins that kill cells. It's not the early smaller size or the large size, which are non-toxic, which you can see by your eye when you look at in brains.
Right.
So the biology has to catch up, and our approach is actually, we've got a very clever assay or a system to detect the neurotoxic form and not all the others, because everyone, otherwise all these clinical trials have been just looking for the ensemble, if you like, rather than the narrow species.
Yes,
that is the problem. So we can capture that species and we can diagnose and say, right, this person may have huge amounts of amyloid, but actually they have huge amounts of this toxic form, and that's why they've got Alzheimer's. Because some people have lots of amyloid and they're perfectly cognitively normal. So that's where we are. We find those toxic species, and the good news is that these toxic species can be disaggregated. They can be
right.
And we have these old drugs, which actually are old antidepressants.
Okay.
Coincidentally, and because they're old drugs, they go to the brain. So then that's a target, and then they can repel these and break them up. And hence the idea is, let's try to break up a lot of these toxic forms so that they stop killing neuronal cells. So that early treatment and early intervention is where we're aiming for, and that's our USP.
Yeah, I see. And as you say there, I guess, like any of these things, catching it early is beneficial, right? And so the diagnosis element becomes key there too.
Yeah. And this is a new paradigm shift in drugs, in terms of medical treatments. Let's use, they call it precision medicine nowadays. So let's diagnose X and Y and Z person, see how much levels of that toxic form they have.
Yes.
And then give them the right sort of medication to get rid of that. And that happens in cancer now. So precision medicine, where they particular genotypes or whatever, then certain drugs are used, which would benefit those. Otherwise, they would not. So this targeting really is quite essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the company is running clinical studies currently. Now I appreciate there'll be some parts of this that are probably confidential, so that's absolutely fine. But yeah, tell us a bit about where you're at with it all, and where you're up to with the research so far.
Yeah, and so we're running a clinical trial, what they call a biomarker trial.
Mm.
And we have patients already with blood. Remember, we're analyzing blood here, which is quite unique because, Alzheimer's was originally identified post-mortem. So people had died, and then you look in slices of the brain and see these aggregates. What we find that these aggregates actually occur in the blood as well. So there's a blood-brain sort of interaction. So you can have it's seeding the brain, So there's the human beings are not just one compartment; they actually interact with the organs. So the study that we have is we have 40 to 80 patients of blood, and then what we're doing there is isolating and showing the fact that these toxic oligomers are present in the compared to control samples who don't have Alzheimer's and the disease. So once we can target those and look at those different levels, then we can identify those people with a lot of those toxic forms and whether we can treat them and maybe even monitor them over time, to see if that, with the drug treatment, to see if those biomarkers go down.
Yes.
That is then you're looking at a kind of physiological response, the biomarker response that actually it is working, but it may take time for cognition to come back. If you've gone too far and a lot of your brain cells are dead, you can't replace brain cells.
Yeah.
If you can go back somewhat and start preventing those deaths, and some of that memory loss can come back, because not all the brain is dead, if you like. So this is what we're doing. So we're doing a biomarker trial with blood, and then we're also next year we're looking to use this biomarker study to select patients, and if we know what their levels are, and then we try our drug treatments. And our drug treatments are these drugs which break apart these oligomers, these toxic things. So then we can monitor them. So it's quite a smart system, because clinical trials have failed, so many times, and there's billions have been spent. And we think, diagnosing the right patients is important, because a lot of clinical trials, they're clinically diagnosed, but they have different types of dementia. So what we're looking at is, reducing that size and making sure it's more precise.
Yes, I see. And being able to find those biomarkers in the blood is crucial to that, right? Because as much as post-mortem diagnosis is scientifically interesting, it's a bit late for that patient at that point.
It is a bit late, yes, absolutely. And there are other fluids that people work with, like CSF, that's the spinal fluid. Those are so painful, the test is so easy to do. And I think this will be, eventually I can see a time where everyone just gives a blood sample, we test it, and they will say, well, actually, you know what? Yeah, your 20 years, it's going to look like this. So what we want to put you is on a kind of preventative medicine. So that you have like a prophylactic course. So you can slow down this disease progression. So that's what we're aiming for anyway.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I guess you could almost see it becoming a bit like getting your prostate checked, right? It's like when you turn 40, you should get that done. And so similarly, you should have these blood tests done, and you should look out for these things at a certain age, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it makes sense. So fascinating. I could ask you lots of questions about this, Farid. I'm sure we'll come back to it. Really keen to dive into your career as well, and the journey you've taken to this. Because you're a scientist by training, from what I can see, and if I'm right, a protein engineer originally.
Yeah, that's right. That's correct.
So tell us a bit about, to start with, why science, why protein engineering, why therapeutics for you? Where did this all come from?
Well, I come from humble backgrounds from Birmingham, inner city Birmingham, and I come from a kind of Pakistani background. I mean, I'm a second generation born here, UK, but our parents were really interested in their children, to become doctors. That was was either doctor or lawyer. That was it. There was no
Right.
or engineer. But I was more interested in the action of drugs in terms of medicine and the pharmacology of those. So it was chemistry and biology and how they interact. This was a fascination.
Mm.
So I was encouraged by my teachers to do biology and chemistry. So I chose a kind of joint honors at Salford University, where I was doing my first degree. But also, if you think about it, all drugs or most drugs actually come from nature. So they come from plants or organisms and etc. So they are almost this right shape, if you like. These drugs are the right keys,
Yes.
which fit the locks of us as organisms, as animals or human beings.
Mm.
So that was my kind of fascination. And one of my heroes at the time when I was looking at this is a woman called Professor Yu Chu, who got a Nobel Prize jointly in 2015, and she was working on a plant called wormwood.
Okay.
And she was looking at texts which were, hundreds of years, if not thousands of years old, of old Chinese texts, which showed that this plant produced a compound which really killed malaria,
I
and
see.
so the parasite itself. So and that product is called artemisinin. It's an amazing natural compound which was then synthesized, etc. But it saved millions of lives. And from where? From knowledge which has been repurposed, if you like, been used over thousands of years. So there's lots of compounds like this. If you take even from the bark of willow, you've had what's it called? Aspirin. So
Right. Yes.
aspirin gets rid of your headache, but also thins your blood. So it has two effects, and one can utilize that effect for different types of diseases. So that was my kind of interest in that kind of, that's what spurred me on and thinking about other drugs and other ways to solve problems quickly without, huge cost and getting it out to people, because there's no point having 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah.
So much development, and also it's a different model from pharmaceutical model as well. It's more of a human model, and this is something which I was quite excited about. And actually, I'll come back to this later on. When I did my degrees at Salford, I went back to Salford University with my team there and decided to look for more compounds and found new compounds, which are old compounds, again, new repurposed compounds for malaria. So, and that was by using a PhD student, and her blood used to grow this malaria parasite. And then I had a library of old drugs, threw them in and found, hey, actually, a couple of these old drugs kill malaria as well. And because they're safe to use, you can utilize it in human beings straight away.
Yes.
And why wouldn't you?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a 2013 publication, which I did. It was called Drug Repurposing for Malaria. And it was with the Salford University group. So you can inflict amazing, therapies within, a year or so, and find these cures, which a lot of people aren't doing. I wrote a book chapter about how to do this as well. So this is the kind of workings, chemistry, biology, drug repurposing, which kind of took my career.
So that idea of repurposing was there quite early on, it sounds like. And I suppose listening to you talk on this, Farid, the other thing that strikes me is that a lot of the new compounds that are being created are inherently becoming more and more complex, right? Because the simple stuff has been done. So then that increases complexity in terms of making them, in terms of replicating them, in terms of scaling them, in terms of getting them into people, increases cost, it does all this stuff. So yeah, I mean, why would you not make the most of?
Yeah, you're on my wavelength.
Yeah.
I mean, we are disruptors, really, because what you wouldn't do this if we were a pharmaceutical company, because hey, you want to have create your own not only patents but the drug supply and everything else. But if all of it exists already, you can't monetize on it.
No.
But it comes down to human life in the end. What's important. But yeah, I mean, the key thing here is it's we were talking about drugs. Majority of drugs are inspired by biological.
Yes, true.
Sort of organisms from plants and others. Even AZT, which was was from a compound from a sponge for HIV. So they do exist. But coming back to really why I was really interested in this.
Yes.
During my year in Salford in 1991 to 92, something strange happened. I took a year out, and I went to this amazing place called Daresbury Laboratory.
Okay.
And Daresbury Laboratory is a synchrotron. So this almost sounds like science fiction, but it's a huge ring, massive ring, where they shoot electron beams and get X-rays at the engine. Now, I was a young guy in my early 20s, so I was placed there in the middle of nowhere for a year, and we were making small crystals, and you shoot these crystals, and then you can look at the shape of molecules. So this is like clathrin, and in some ways there was also hemoglobin as well to look at, because the shape of molecules matter and how they interact with drugs.
Right, yes.
So there I met this old guy who was opposite me, and he was saying, "Oh, Farid, I'm making these little red crystals of hemoglobin." Later on during that afternoon, I found out he's the Nobel Prize winner, Max Perutz, from Peterhouse College. And, so I was pretty amazed, I thought, wow, he's here, he's doing all his work. But later on, when I worked at GlaxoSmithKline, because I was doing drug development, I decided at GSK, I hit a ceiling, and I needed to do a PhD because I only had my master's.
I see, yeah.
And I got to do a PhD in MRC, Medical Research Council. And guess who was there? Max Perutz.
Really?
Kind of circular there. I was working in a group with Sophie Jackson and Professor Alan First, working on protein folding. Now, everything what we're talking about, these proteins which are toxic form, these are proteins which change shape and they misfold. So my PhD in protein engineering was all about how do these proteins come together and fold and make aggregation and etc. So that gave me the kind of biophysical sense of how to prepare proteins, understand the mechanisms, etc. So that then also folded into the kind of career path that I wanted, and in particular, now that I'm focused on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other CNS diseases as well.
Yeah, and it's amazing to think that you can almost just bump into these giants of the scientific world, right?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm still a senior research fellow as well at Peterhouse College, and Max Perutz was from Peterhouse as well. But I think Cambridge, Oxford, these places are pretty unique.
True.
The UK and biotech. Cambridge is probably the #1 place which has made billions in biotech sector, unlike other places like Manchester where we are at the moment. But we want to change that. We want to. I don't know how to use that word, level up, but we want to bring up these innovation, and in particular, these big questions with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other diseases as well. So this is something that we're keen to do up here north.
No, absolutely, and I think there's a huge amount of. I'm from Manchester actually, so disclaimer this. There's a huge amount of intellectual capital up there, right, with the university and with the people who graduated from AstraZeneca up there, and all the companies that have been starting since they moved on, and alongside that, so there's a population of scientists there that can really do something if they get together. And of course, it's a big city, and you've got infrastructure and resources, and you've got access to the rest of the north. There's no reason it shouldn't be the next cluster, right?
Absolutely. Tom, we need you back. I don't know where you are now.
I'm in Cardiff now,
Oh, are
actually.
you? Okay.
Yes, yes. Um, so talk us through the rest of it. So you went and did your PhD. You were, from what you've said, you were working alongside that at GSK. Tell us about the rest of your career. Tell us about where it went from there.
Yeah, I think what happens as a scientist, you get into a trap. You do your first degree, second degree, third degree, whatever, and you're almost conditioned, to do research and development. You don't look at the bigger picture. You don't look at, how can you impact outside of that? Because your mindset is just, hey, I'm going to get another grant and take you down that route. And unfortunately, a lot of, people go down that route, and it's tentative. They get, very. But I was thinking the opposite. I mean, when after my PhD at Cambridge, I went to an institute called Babraham Institute, and I was working with a guy called Mike Towsett there, and we were responsible to develop technology, sort of evolution-based technologies, and we worked with a few spin-out companies as well to spin out technology. And that got me thinking of, really, can we be more entrepreneurial and really make products that can be utilized? So that's where I started thinking for a long while, to create your own company.
Yes.
Then I spent 4 years in 2006. I went to the University of Manchester, and I stayed there for about 4 years. And in 2010, I spun out my first company, which is called Protein Technologies Limited, based in Manchester. And the focus there was to work on recombinant proteins. So, human proteins and producing them in E. coli and cells and etc. So that, and so it was all about protein engineering. This is during Manchester and protein technologies. I met a guy called Andrew Doig, Professor Andrew Doig, and we sat together. And he's a professor of biochemistry and has got a lot of interest in Alzheimer's. And I had a lot of ideas about drugs and using those. So at the university, we did a PhD student. We had a PhD student working with us, and we screened lots of drugs to see if inhibit some of these toxic oligomers. And we found that we could, that some of these drugs did work, and we also in-licensed a number of compounds. Then suddenly PharmaKure, was born. So the first company was only a CRO, then PharmaKure is more focused on drug research. And we got our first bit of money from family and friends and small sort of VC funding, what we call micro seed funding.
Yeah.
And that was in 2018-19. And then we got 4 million from partly from the Future Fund and private investor in 2021. So that then accelerated us straight to clinical trials, both the biomarker human trial and then to the drug trial that we want to do next year. So that's kind of the journey. But again, it's tough. You don't have your parachute as an academic. You're out there, trying to whip up people to give you funding.
Yes.
Take it forward. And, and a lot of pharma companies aren't interested in repurposing, but we want to make that change. And often, we're working with other partners around this. We're fundraising right now as well. But we want to make this work because I think the combination of diagnostics and the treatment, they go hand in hand. But it costs, as you know, Tom, a lot of money to do these trials.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So that's where we're at. First trial we started right now, actually, the biomarker trial. And the next trial will be on the drugs next year.
Yeah, makes sense. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that I'd like to ask more about there. So you took this step into an entrepreneurial career. Really, it sounds like through wanting to have greater impact and wanting to help more directly impact patients. And I'm guessing that you hadn't had a huge amount of sort of business training or anything formal like that at that point.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was funny because when we started the first venture, indeed PharmaKure as well, there was a lot of courses, entrepreneurial courses, and you could go on.
Yeah.
But then, we just realized that actually, we've done all of that, entrepreneurs, and it's so specific what we're doing. Raising funding, doing, making slides even for investors, understanding what an exit position means. How does the company exit? In biotech, we're talking, years, it could be 5 years, it could be more, etc. And a lot of risk averseness. Alzheimer's is hard. It's so many failures. Nobody wants to touch it. So how do you square that? In some ways, COVID helped us in a weird way, where we had the Future Fund.
Right.
It's really for those innovation-based companies, and hence the government puts in half the funds, if you like, and we had a prime minister. So, and actually COVID on a different slant. When you get COVID, you also get brain fog as well. And there's evidence that these toxic proteins are created.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That's something else which is quite interesting that we're looking into as well. But back to the entrepreneurial side of things. I think you have to work on it on the job, but your mindset has to change. I mean, I was lucky because I worked for GlaxoSmithKline before I did a PhD.
Right.
So I was a kind of mature student, if you like. So I knew practicalities of deadlines and making things, actually making a product, if you like, these biomarkers. So I mean, my theory is that no one should do a PhD unless they had, 1 or 2 industrial experiences. Otherwise, they're fixed in the academic zone.
Yes.
Never change that. If you go out of it, then you can be a little bit more entrepreneurial. And I think that's the key elements. You need to be out in industry. Otherwise, a bit like Gollum in his cave, you'll become a creature of it.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And I often think this about MBAs as well, right? Is that if you do an MBA straight after your bachelor's degree, for example, it's going to be hard to draw parallels between that and business and the real world. Whereas if you've got a bit of experience in the business world prior to going and doing it, there's going to be a lot more context that you bring to that. I guess it's the same sort of idea.
Yes, it is. And also, you don't have a parachute as well. I mean,
right.
When you're employed by yourself, more or less, when you first start, you've got to, you don't have salary sometimes. How do you cope with that? So you have to have some sort of mitigation, and you've got to have some other balance. I mean, I was lucky I had another company that could part support me.
Yes.
So one has to think of those things, because otherwise it's mentally hard, and and getting the right team as well. And I tapped back into Cambridge University, which was still open to me. You've got to get those contacts, and also friends. I've got a very close friend of mine called Dr. Naz Bashir. We worked on a different project, and then he also did a lot of work in clinical sciences. Sometimes you bring those people in kind initially, but so you have to entrepreneurial. You have to be frugal, and I think that's probably back to my roots, really, where I had to be frugal when we began in humble beginnings back in Birmingham. You've got to find other ways to do things. Those favors. But it works. It does work, and now it's just you need that. Whatever happens, you need that quantum of funds to get you forward. And
absolutely.
That's a dark art. It's who who you contact. It's not very logical as a scientist to find funding, because that is a strange thing. That's a strange beast, which I've raised money and things, but it's always the same. But those are important aspects. And once you got into those networks, especially in Northwest, you get a lot less sort of VCs as you do in London and the Triangle, as they call it.
Yes, yeah, it makes sense. And so I guess a lot of very smart private investors who are probably quite hard to convince, but at least you're not trying to persuade a consortium of people, right? So it's
Yes, yes, yes,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
And I suppose in starting PharmaKure, obviously different business model to your first business, some scientific themes running through it, but different objectives and different sort of funding structure, different cost structure, all that kind of stuff. But I imagine there are things that you learned from that first business that you took into PharmaKure. Anything particularly that stands out that you learned through the first phase of your entrepreneurial journey that was useful in the second phase?
Yeah, yes, I think making proteins is key, and we had a lot of
Hmm.
interactions from our first company and working with other. So one thing was quite interesting. So Protein Technologies had a collaboration with a company called Synapsed, and they
Okay.
were developing this biomarker. And cut a long story short, we thought this was a really good assay, blood-based assay, and then PharmaKure really wanted it, but we couldn't. We didn't have the money at the time, but
Hmm.
we did a bit of work with them, and that relationship became pretty strong. And in 2021, we bought the company out.
I see. Okay.
So it came via that route, and so there was a synergy there, and I think everything became focused in the sense that in GSK we had assays and understanding. PhD gave me the protein side of things, so it all came together, if you like.
Mm.
And from there, we had a lot of clinical assistance through other partners as well. So, and indeed, that incubator, Protein Technologies, incubated PharmaKure for a couple of months as well.
Right.
So they were inside the incubator as well. So they utilized the equipment, they utilized the resources that were there. So we didn't have to buy all the equipment, which is quite a massive cost for a small company. So
Yes.
that gave us that uplift. And recently we've just moved to other labs and become more independent and a bit more grown up. So that's all good as well. So, there was all these little steps.
Mm.
But it is a learning curve, and it's always I think the exciting thing is we're looking more translationally now. We're
Yeah.
now working with patients. If we prove this works, then it's a big deal. We're working with other partners as well. We're doing some grant applications. We're looking in Parkinson's, and there's high profile people on grants there as well that we're looking into.
Yeah.
And Parkinson's is another devastating disease, as you will know from some famous people. Michael J. Fox, for example, and their foundation as well.
Mm-hmm. No,
Yeah.
of course. Of
Yeah.
course. And so I suppose looking back on the last 4 years and prior to that, and you may have mentioned some of this already. So no problem if you have, it's fine to repeat that. But if you were starting out on this journey again of starting PharmaKure or starting Protein Technologies, or even if it was just starting out on your scientific career again, what do you think are the things that you've learned that you would have liked to know earlier on? What's the advice that you would give to yourself? What things do you think have been particularly formative lessons for you over your career, Farid?
Oh, that's a very good question. If we have to really rewind the clock a bit, because there's a lot of learning here.
Mm.
Yeah, what I've learned is, and I think this is now widely established, everything is not to do with the innovation. It's
Right.
actually timing. Timing is more important than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps location as well. I would add that. So,
Okay.
for example, retrospectively, maybe I should have stayed in that golden triangle, because that's where, the big bucks are.
Mm.
If you're outlier, it's just, hey, where's Manchester, let alone anywhere else. But coming back, the other thing is, there's a company which is in the news now, which has shown that an antibody can give some sort of effects for Alzheimer's. This is quite big news. So it's an antibody. It's a very expensive way to deliver the drug, but at least that antibody shows that, you know, what we're doing mechanistically at least is correct. You know?
Yes.
But we're working about a pill. You know, we're not talking about an intravenous system that probably costs £250,000 a year. We're talking a very, very inexpensive method of utilizing our drugs. So the timing is absolutely right now. Everybody now is going towards this. Hey, there is a possibility that we can now have therapeutics for this.
Yes.
Timing is absolute. And second thing is that diagnostic piece is also coming together. A lot of people are now looking into diagnosing these, and there's a lot of grant applications, but also commercial need, massive need to do that. So I think we're in the right timing now. Would I do that before? I wouldn't like to have tried to convince someone 10 years ago.
Sure.
You've just spent £1 billion on, you know, 100 clinical trials which have failed. So as of now, at least 1 or 2 clinical trials have been, you know, have worked, but in a very small subset of patients. So we're in this kind of curve that's going up now. So the resurgence is definitely going forward. So I'm quite excited about that. So I think this timing is right.
Yeah.
And I think there's a number of new VCs that are focused on the North now as well.
True. Yes.
Very specifically. So perhaps that timing is right for us to tap up those funds as well.
Yeah.
Take it further. But I think there should be more sort of funding for SMEs, especially in this sector, because it costs so much for us in the UK on the NHS. If we can early diagnose and treat patients earlier, then I think there should be funding, government funding specifically for this, for these kind of companies, at least to get them over the proof of concept that their technology works. So there's Innovate UK. There's a couple of other grant schemes that can come into this, but I think the timing is right now, and so
yeah,
that's why I feel we're ready to take action now.
And I suppose, I mean, this is not necessarily something that you've touched on, but I guess it sort of leads on to this, that yes, there's one of the challenges around some of these drugs that you're repurposing is what's the incentive for the pharmaceutical companies as they're coming off patent. But this whole idea of diagnosis and prevention rather than cure, right? There's this whole issue of reimbursement around that, and I think the pressure is rising on governments to do something about that, because I think, you know, I've seen over the last few years, last sort of 6 or 7 years particularly, there's a growing realization that actually we should be getting involved in some of this stuff earlier than we are doing. And I saw I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I saw a great presentation from a guy. He was a business development guy from Johnson & Johnson, and he was quoting a guy called Bill Hain, who was I don't know if that's how to pronounce it, but he's the head of R&D at the time for Janssen. And he had this great quote where he said, you know, in 100 years' time, they're going to look back and say, hang on, you waited until people were sick and then you did something about it. And I think that realization that actually we're looking at this problem the wrong way around is growing. It's difficult to turn a ship like government and big industry and things like that, but I think you're probably starting to see the cracks in that establishment of reimbursement form, which will, I guess, create opportunities for companies like yours, where it is about diagnosis and efficient use of medicines and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely agree, Tom. I mean, interestingly, you know, it was in the Second World War and prior to that, where penicillin came about.
Mm-hmm.
And penicillin could only be developed, by the way, when the government put money into it,
right, and
most money into it, and then you had some other private partners, namely, you know, pharma companies, and that's why they could then manufacture it as well. You know, it was all about manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
And so is it what they call a kind of, public-private partnerships, PPPs.
Yeah.
And it's, it was necessary. Otherwise, people died, in surgery. Right? And a war was beginning and ended. And without penicillin, it would have been much harder.
Yes.
And so that was a breakthrough. So, now we should be looking at these devastating diseases, which are going to affect us. And these diseases, I said, they could be induced by infection, but primarily the culprits that cause these memory losses are proteins. So maybe it's a different target that we need to assess. So I think, with that, we need more of these kind of partnerships. And if we can get us to a place that, hey, we can delay this onset disease, then we're a step forward. And then we can develop more drugs, because remember, penicillin was the first one, and then they started adding other molecules to it and became much more efficacious and etc. And everything. Then we can take it to the next level, but we need the first set, the first generation.
Yes.
And that's what we want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the evidence the last few years is that when some of these frameworks are removed, I mean, of course you need regulation and things need to be safe and things need to be done properly. But, you see in the COVID pandemic that there are incredible things that can be done when some of these barriers are removed, right? And hopefully gradually that continues to erode the edges of the stuff that's maybe a bit less necessary than people think it is currently.
Yeah, agreed. I think watch this space. I think we're a very small company, but if you look at us, we're equivalent to very large companies in terms of we're in human beings. We're not talking about testing in mice or anything else. So we do punch above our weight. And that's pretty spectacular. And a company, UK-based company up north. And, I think that's something to be celebrating in its own right, and we should be worth huge amounts, But I think, we need to get there. And once the results come out, this is something quite exciting for us. And we hope, we want to, make an impact in these diseases and Alzheimer's in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's really important work, and it's really good to see a novel approach to it. Farid, we wish you the best of luck. It's a pivotal time for you, and we'll keep an eye out.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks for joining us on Careers in Discovery, and don't forget to subscribe for more insight into the world of drug discovery and R&D. Do take a look at our sponsors, Singular Talent, and their mission to make hiring better for companies and individuals in drug discovery and R&D. You can find them at www.singulartalent.io. See you next time.